Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Mohammed Kantawi and I am a university teacher. In today's session we are going to speak about linguistics of first year. So this lesson is within university actual lessons. So it's the lessons of my students at university or at École Normale Supérieure. In today's session we shall be talking about language and communication and the difference between them. In this episode I shall be talking about 5 points concerning language and communication. The first point would be about the definition of communication and the definition of language. The second point would be about mediums of communication, and the third point would be about understandability and ambiguity, and the fourth point would be about encoding and decoding, and the last point would be about language twisting and language defiance. So let's begin. How do we define language? Language is a tool for communication, and it is more than that. Simplistically, it is a tool for communication, but if we go deeper with language to define it, we would say that language is divine in principle. It has got to do with God, and it's God who bestowed language upon humanity to speak and to write and to communicate. Communication is a process between interlocutors, either 2 interlocutors or 3 or 4 or more. This process is all about conveying messages and understanding them. So the speaker would convey the message to the listener, and the listener tries to decode that message. And sometimes understanding happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes because of ambiguity, and sometimes misunderstanding transpires. And so we have got to be careful in terms of communication, because we say it is communication, but sometimes the communication breaks down because of ambiguity or because of bad use of language, and sometimes because of the lack of understanding on the part of the listener. And so this is about communication and language. The second point is about mediums of communication. We have got 4 mediums of communication. We communicate in speaking, we communicate in writing, and we communicate in sign language, and we communicate in silence. And so the first part is very clear: to speak to other people, to make them understand the language you speak in, and they try to make sense of what you're saying. That's speaking. To have your words as atoms in the air and waves, and so the listener would listen to you and understand and make sense of that message, and he would respond to you. So that's speaking. Within speaking, it depends whether your pronunciation is clear, whether your use of language is clear and easy, and whether you know the language very well in order to communicate well. That is speaking. In writing, it's a more complex process, because in writing you have got to think how to write, how to structure your sentences in order to make them accessible to anyone who read. So readers would try to read your books or your message and try to make sense of it. Now, if the language is somewhat notoriously difficult, so they may not make sense of your message. So communication would break down. And so sometimes readers would have to go to the dictionary to look up some difficult words you have used in your writing. And so that's the medium of writing. Within writing, we have different genres in terms of communication. We can communicate through novels, we can communicate through magazines, through newspapers, through blogs on the internet, through articles, through essays, different genres. And so that's the second point about speaking and writing. And then the third point within the second part, would be communicating through sign language. And this is for the dumb and the deaf. People who can't speak and who can't listen or who can't hear, they have to have sign language. And sign language is all about symbols and gestures between those interlocutors. And they can understand one another or each other when they communicate through sign language. It could be, the sign language would be from the facial expressions, sometimes from the hands, sometimes from the legs, sometimes from only the eyes, sometimes from the lips. And so it's all about sign language. This is the third point. The last point within this point, within the second part in this lesson, is about silence. No doubt, silence is communication sometimes. And I give the example of breaking into a prison, and you find the prisoner and you want to avenge him, you want to kill him or to do harm to him, and then you find the guard there. If the guard is your friend and he knew that you are going to kill him or to do harm to this prisoner and he kept silent, that's a message to you. You can understand that he is saying to you, you can do whatever you want to this prisoner, and so you will do whatever you want to this prisoner. And so communication happened because of the silence of the guard of the prison. And so these are the four mediums through which we communicate. We communicate through speaking, writing, sign language, and silence. The third point is about understandability and ambiguity. Sometimes when people communicate, they can't understand each other, or they can't understand one another if it is plural. The understandability of language depends upon the good use of language. This is one. The second point depends upon the knowledge of the interlocutors about that language. Now, if I, for example, I know Arabic, I know English, so I can communicate with people, I can understand them, they can understand me. But if I don't know a particular language and they communicate to me in that language, for example, Greek or Hebrew or Latin or French, that I don't understand, and so I can't understand them well. And so understandability of that language doesn't happen. Sometimes even if you understand the language, ambiguity happens. Ambiguity happens because either lexically or structurally, lexically or syntactically. Lexically in terms of the words you use, and structurally or syntactically in terms of the construction of the sentence or the phrase or the clause. And so it depends. Sometimes ambiguity happens because of using very, very difficult language. Now, if the words are not accessible to the reader or to the listener, understanding or communication would break down. And so that is understandability and ambiguity. The purpose of communication is to make other people understand us. It's not about ambiguating the message. No doubt sometimes when we write, we want to imbue our writing with beauty, with elegance, with compendiousness, with a certain amount of little amount of verbosity. We would like to use words which are very beautiful and appealing and interesting to other people to look at and to read. They are appealing in terms of pronunciation, they are appealing in terms of the look. And so we tend to use such vocabulary, but although, or despite the fact that readers cannot understand them only by checking the dictionary or by looking up the dictionary. And so writing is not like speaking in terms of understandability and ambiguity. And so the writer would like to be creative in his writing, and so he would use some particular language in his writing that is not very, very accessible to beginners. And so the writer is targeting a certain audience of a certain level of competency. Not all people can read to anyone. So that's understandability and ambiguity. The fourth point is about encoding and decoding. So communication happens by the speaker encoding a certain message to the listener, and then the listener tries to decode that message. And so the speaker is a speaker now, and the listener is a listener now, and then they turn the exchange. The listener becomes the speaker, and the speaker becomes the listener. And this is the way communication happens. It happens through encodings and decodings, through understanding between those interlocutors, either 2 or 3 or 4 or more. The last point is about language twisting and language defiance. This is an additional point that I didn't mention in the handout, and I'd like to explain it deeply. Language twisting is all about the power that a speaker or a writer exercises upon language by using metaphors, and we call it metaphorization, and by using idioms, and we call it idiomization. So if the writer, particularly the writer, the speaker, yes, he can, no doubt, but particularly the writer, he would try to metaphorize his language and idiomize his language, as if the writer is saying to language that I can play using you, I can play with words. I can use metaphors and people can understand me. I can use idioms and people who are similar who are culturally similar to me can understand me. And so this is language twisting. It means you are, as a writer or a speaker, more powerful than language. The second point is about language defiance. Language defiance is about the language exercising power against you. And that means that there are certain sentences or certain ideas within language that you logically don't accept, but you can do nothing about it. Like, for example, the use of some particular verbs, like the verb to die. When you take the example, he died yesterday, as if we are looking at this sentence, that the person did death, but he didn't. We don't do death. Death topples us. Death befalls us. And so here you can do nothing about language to twist it. You're supposed now to surrender to language, and it is called language defiance. It means language is defiant to you as a speaker or as a writer. So we spoke in this episode about 5 points. We spoke about the definition of communication and language. We spoke about the mediums of communication, the 4 mediums of communication. We spoke about the difference between, or the relationship between understandability and ambiguity. We spoke about encodings and decodings. And we spoke the last point about language twisting and language defiance. Thank you so much and goodbye.